After years of populist rule in Poland, Donald Tusk became Prime Minister for a second time at the end of 2023. As the former President of the European Council, Tusk's comeback symbolised hope for change. But has he succeeded? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, as Donald Tusk nears the end of his first year back in office, his leadership has faced both praise and criticism. Let's take a look at how his electoral success has shaped Poland.
It's the sound of celebration, marking the end of an 8-year era of populist rule.
I have never been so happy in my life with second place. Poland has won. Democracy has won. We have removed them from power.
Donald Tusk was elected Prime Minister for the second time in December 2023, bringing the European Union's former communist eastern flank into an hopeful era. His coalition promised bold reforms and a new direction for the country. There have been some early successes. The release of EU funds, which was frozen after the previous government brought in reforms undermining judicial independence.
These decisions will free up to 137 billion euros for Poland.
But not everything goes as easily as planned. Tusk's pledge to reform Poland's restrictive abortion laws has stalled because of disagreements within his coalition and the likelihood of a presidential veto. And while he has introduced measures to penalize hospitals that refuse legal abortions, the more sweeping changes he promised remain difficult. Critics also accuse his government of selective transparency due to the barring of right-wing TV Republika from press conferences. Nobody said it was going to be easy, and he himself realizes that.
We have a portfolio of projects, and almost each one of them signifies a better life for the people. We are determined to move forward with these initiatives.
As Poland reflects on 1 year under Tusk leadership, the question is, can Tusk deliver all the transformational change he promised?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Warsaw is Marcin Matczak. He's a lawyer and professor at the University of Warsaw. In Brighton, in the UK, we have Aleks Szczerbiak, politics professor at the University of Sussex. In Oxford, Anna Stanisz-Lubowiecka. She's a lecturer in social linguistics at the University of Reading. And here with me in the studio, I'm delighted to say, is Anita Prazmowska. She's professor in international history at the London School of Economics. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Anita, to you first, give me your impressions of the year Donald Tusk has had.
A difficult year because there were great expectations with the elections. What was so interesting is the numbers of people that turned out to vote. People who felt that there was time for change, but also vested great hopes that there were going to be reforms specifically relating to what it is that they thought was going wrong in Poland. So it was for women, women's rights, fertility rights, in terms of, legality, in terms of, the sort of if that's the right word, reforms that the previous government was introducing. So the liberal, intellectual, academic community, young people who really had enough of this nationalist rhetoric and changes of curricula at schools and the presence of the church everywhere. So these people turned up. Everybody wanted to vote. Now, Tusk couldn't, it was inevitable, could not fulfill these expectations. But one of the biggest problems he has is that the president belongs to the old regime, and therefore he has the right of veto. And that has really held back Tusk. But also, the government that Tusk is leading is a coalition government. So there is an awful lot in terms of what might hold him back, where he will have to play carefully, where we'll have to be exercising diplomacy and caution, and also the realization that he can only do so much because he's going to come up against peace, which is still very strong there.
Anna, is that a fair assessment? You've got your Prime Minister being held back by your President?
Yes, I think so. I think one of the very important things to be remembered about Poland is that it's an incredibly polarized country. And that's been the case for the last 8 or 10 years, especially since 2016, when state media became controlled by law and justice. And also, if we look at the election results, recent election results, we can see that Polish society is split pretty much 50-50. And Polish people have been reading different newspapers, following different TV channels. And also that's exacerbated by social media, which support the development of ideological bubbles. And Donald Tusk was one of the main pillars of the propaganda that was promoted in state media during the time when Law and Justice was in power, so between 2016 and 2023. And there are still lots of very, very negative attitudes towards Donald Tusk, which I think will be quite crucial in the upcoming election.
Marcin, give us your impression of the relationship then between Prime Minister and President. Tusk clearly feels held back by your president?
Yes, of course. Our president, Andrzej Duda, has the veto right, and he has used this right several times during last year. But nevertheless, I think I would not be so harsh in assessing Tusk. Lawyers make a distinction between law in action and law in the books. And of course, it was very difficult for Tusk and his government to change the law in the books, because that requires the consent of President Duda. However, they have changed a lot as far as the law in practice is concerned, in action. They stopped the disciplinary proceedings against the judges. They changed their approach to how the Polish judges apply the EU law. And sometimes people ask, how is it possible that Tusk, without changing the legislation, could release the money from the European Union? And the answer is because he was able to change the law in practice, law in action. So even if he has Andrzej Duda as his opponent, and even if Duda blocked several attempts to reform the judiciary and the constitutional court and so on and so on. So nevertheless, I would wait till the next presidential election with Duda leaving the palace, the presidential palace, and then assess how effective this government is in the area I'm interested in, the rule of law.
Aleks, do you think Poland is being held back then by this kind of fracture between president and prime minister?
Well, I mean, as the other panelists have said, the president does have a veto power, which the government doesn't have a majority to overturn. There are also certain appointments that have to be confirmed by the president, and this is the other important pillar of the current government's policy. It's basically replacing the elites, the people that were appointed by the previous government, and replacing them with people who are more sympathetic to them. And there are certain posts that, and they've managed to get around this in certain ways, but there are certain posts they can't do this. Ambassadorial appointments, for example, which is obviously very topical now that there's going to be a new president in America. But I think one thing we should bear in mind here is that although the president is obviously not very sympathetic to the government, it's also a kind of convenient excuse, really, for a government. I mean, some of the things that it's not achieved, I mean, the Civic Platform programme was called 100 Specifics in 100 Days. Okay, these are 100 specific policies that they would implement. I don't know, on the latest kind of, obviously it's much more than 100 days, it's nearly a year now, and they've implemented maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 or something of those. And that includes things that wouldn't be vetoed by the president. For example, substantially increasing tax allowances. That was one of their sort of key promises, and they've made it clear that they're not going to do this, probably not even in the whole of the parliament. There are also some of these reforms which they're blaming on the president, but they haven't actually even got the legislation through parliament. So in terms of judicial reform, I mean, undoubtedly the president would veto any reforms that attempted to undermine judges that he appointed, which is what some of the government's judicial reforms would do, because he's very protective of judges that he appointed. But there isn't actually been any legislation before him for him to veto. Similarly with abortion that Anita mentioned, Abortion is an issue that the government hasn't actually got any legislation through Parliament for him to veto. The one bill that actually went through the whole legislative process, which was to decriminalise assisting an abortion, was actually defeated in Parliament because members of the coalition have actually voted against it. So, I mean, undoubtedly he's a bloc, and they can't complete elite appointments that they want to. They won't get legislation that they want to. But it's also quite a good excuse for them for why they haven't implemented their policies, which they haven't in a lot of cases, and it's causing a lot of frustration, including among people who voted for them.
Anita, talk to me about how Polish people feel about Ukraine, the ongoing war. We're approaching the 3rd anniversary now. This has been huge for Poland, the Polish psyche, the Polish military. Give me your impression of the war in Ukraine.
When the war in Ukraine started, there was immense outpouring of support. Ukrainians, all the past conflicts, and there's quite a lot of history there, was set aside because what the Poles saw was women and children in flight. And it reminded Poles of their own history. But that is just the starting point, and some very impressive initiatives there, and kindness. And the government legislation likewise followed in terms of allowing Ukrainian people to work immediately, all the provisions for, care to be put in place. But with time, as we know, there is a certain weariness, and there's two issues here. One, what has happened to the Ukrainians? The Ukrainians were seen as a source of labor. Poland is short of labor. Many Poles work abroad. Poland is short of labor. So they were welcomed in places of employment. But they actually, what has been noticed, they actually emancipated themselves. They started setting up their own businesses, working for each other. I didn't necessarily stay there. And men stayed in Ukraine because they are held back by a military requirement. So that's one issue. So now there is starting to be a debate and open questions about, well, how much is this costing us? How much longer? Why do Ukrainians get access to housing? Now, second problem is the way in which the Poles felt that the Ukrainian issue relegated Poland in European politics. Poland always saw itself as being on the fault line between the East and West, perceiving themselves to be part of the civilized West. They were fine with Ukraine as long as Ukraine accepted Poland's role in terms of being the power structure. But once the war started and it became an international issue, and relations between the American politicians and Zelensky bypassed Poland, and then Scholz, Macron, they are speaking directly to Zelensky, and Poland is not part of that dialogue. The feeling is that maybe this has gone too far. Maybe Poland is being relegated now to a state through which goods pass to Ukraine, with Poland no longer having that key role in that region.
Anna, back to you on that. Give us your impression of war fatigue then. Have Polish people had enough of supporting Ukraine?
Well, I think I agree with many points that Anita has just made. So first of all, the war came as a huge shock to Poland. I happened to be in Poland on the day when the war broke out, and people were absolutely horrified. And we could see those amazing gestures of kindness at the beginning. Now, obviously, that's not really sustainable over such a long stretch of time. We're talking about 3 years at the moment. And with some of the issues that Anita mentioned, including economic issues, the inflation, and also the huge security threat. So there is this very strong sense of threat of a potential Russian invasion in Poland, which still paralyzes quite a lot of people. And this is something that Tusk has talked about as well. The other thing is we can see some anti-Ukrainian sentiments in Poland, and they are related to many things that Anita mentioned before, but including an incredibly complicated history between Poland and Ukraine. So western parts of Ukraine belonged to the Polish territory for quite some time in the past. And this is something that Karol Nawrocki, the oppositional candidate, is already bringing up in his discourse before the presidential election. So he's already talking about the Volhynia massacre that happened during the Second World War, a kind of inflating some of these anti-Ukrainian sentiments. So yes, there is less support, and I worry that some of the rhetoric that is used about Ukrainians is not going to help them.
Marcin, give us your thoughts then. Do you think the Polish people think Ukraine today, Poland tomorrow?
Definitely, the attitude of the Polish people towards our neighbors from the Ukraine has changed since the beginning of the war, and I think it's a part of our attitude to immigration generally. And there is an interesting issue happening now in Poland. You know, all the people after the Law and Justice's government have discussed whether there is possibility for a non-populist politics after such a populist government. And the answer is no. Donald Tusk is becoming now a populist, I believe. As you probably heard, he recently proposed to suspend the asylum right for the people coming to Poland. He was not addressing directly the Ukrainians, of course, but I think now this anti-immigration sentiment in Poland is growing, and some political parties like Konfederacja, for example, is using it very, very much to gain some support. So it's a very complex issue, and I hope that Donald Tusk, who has always been very open to migration, will not become the real populist, but who knows?
Aleks, just on the Ukraine war, one final point. Do you think it has completely changed the political landscape in terms of how people are thinking in Poland?
No, I don't think it has. I mean, it has in the sense that obviously Poland is a frontline state, and therefore what's going on its eastern border is in the mind, as the other panelists have said, is in the minds of Poles in a way that it's not. I mean, I live in the UK, and on the Polish news, there's something about the war in Ukraine. There's a major item on it, as item 2, 3, sometimes even number 1. In Britain, I mean, there's maybe an item once a week or something like that. So, I mean, in that sense, it obviously has. I think the other panelists have kind of picked on the areas that where those attitudes are changing. I mean, there's obviously the attitudes towards Ukrainian migrants. And I think the thing to bear in mind is that actually, even right from the very beginning, there was always, even when there was great sympathy to Ukrainian migrants, there's always a feeling that they shouldn't be entitled to the same kind of welfare benefits, for example, as Poles. There was always a majority against that. There's now a majority against admitting further Ukrainian migrants. Poles now say we've kind of had enough. But I think the real sort of difference is that, I mean, basically Poland and Ukraine have an overarching common interest in terms of opposing Russian aggression and Russian expansionism. But on lots of other issues, they have different interests. Okay, and I think one of the problems that people thought there was that Poland wasn't using the leverage that it had through its humanitarian response, through the fact that it's a hub for military aid, a key ally, to actually leverage some of those areas where Polish and Ukrainian interests are different. For example, on the grain issue, in terms of agriculture, there are clearly clashing interests between Poland and Ukraine on this issue. On historical questions, I mean, Poles do not feel that Ukrainians have adequately come to terms with the Volhynia massacre, as Anna said. So, and I think there's a feeling that the Polish government haven't really used this opportunity that they had, the tremendous dependence that Ukraine had at one stage, in order to leverage these areas where Polish and Ukrainian interests clash. And of course, now what Ukraine has done, again, as the other panelists have mentioned, is that they're now bypassing Poland. I mean, they're developing links with Berlin, for example. That seems to be more important to them than developing links with Warsaw. Berlin, of course, who was perfectly happy to develop bilateral relations with Russia, to rely on energy security for Russian oil and gas. And now, because Ukraine wants to get in the EU, they've once again prioritized relations with Germany, which is, again, a very frustrating thing I think, for polls and for Polish leaders. And you're also seeing members of the governing coalition, coming up with this kind of rhetoric. Members of the governing coalition are saying things like Ukraine cannot be admitted to the EU until it deals with these historical issues, until it comes to terms with the Wołyń massacre. So this isn't just something that people in the political opposition are raising. This is also government ministers are starting to use this rhetoric now as well.
Anita, 2025 will bring a presidential election in Poland. So Tusk's man will be the mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski. He's likely to be up against an opposition candidate, Karol Nawrocki. How important is it for Tusk that his man wins and he has a president of Poland who doesn't veto everything he wants to do?
Well, it's very interesting that I recently read an article in one of the most sort of opinion-forming magazine called Politica, and they said, well, actually, we might lose the next general election because even if they get the president, the weakness of the present government is already visible. In opinion polls, the ruling coalition's ranking is lower than the opposition. So even if they win the presidential elections, they already are calculating that 2 years after the presidential elections, they might lose. Now, what can you do during the period of 2 years? In the end, there are major problems here in terms of can they reverse the reforms and legislative initiatives that have been put forward by the previous opposition. Now, can they do it legally? So many of the issues that the present government is critical of is corruption, misuse of government funding, the terrible consequences of the change of the judiciary, the relationship between judiciary. Can this be done by government diktat? Well, no, because that would suggest that the government is doing exactly what the previous government did, which is appropriating decisions which are not political. So the feeling is that the government during the next 2 years might, even if they win, get their man into the presidential role, that they still will not know quite how to proceed because you cannot reverse what had happened earlier. So slow reforms perhaps, and it has been said here, even that critical issue of abortion. This is not the government that is leading. Tusk is holding back on that one.
Anna, do you think Donald Tusk can turn it around in 2025?
Meaning if Trzaskowski can win?
Yes, and Tusk can keep going with his project. Do you think he has any chance of success in the new year?
Well, I think Trzaskowski is an incredibly popular mayor of Warsaw, and he's already shown in the previous presidential election in 2020 that he can get many, many votes and a lot of support from the electorate. So that is certainly going to help him. On the other hand, Nawrocki is a little bit of an enigma. He just showed up in the front line of Polish politics, and that's actually the strategy that Jarosław Kaczyński used 10 years ago with Andrzej Duda as well. It's because mostly for PR issues, so he's not popular enough himself. With the previous presidential, the latest president, with the latest parliamentary election, many experts said that Donald Tusk has to form a coalition with many other parties, including Szymon Hołownia's Polska 2050. That's exactly what they did. And it's because they united that they managed to win. It's a frequent observation within the study of social movements that after a critical moment when many groups, many different ideological groups come together to basically win something, change something in politics, these groups tend to dissolve because of different ideological reasons. And this is something that Anita mentioned as well, and we can see that in what is happening in Polish politics at the moment, that bond created within the so-called democratic opposition is not as strong as it used to be. And the very fact that we're going to have more candidates, more presidential candidates, in a way that's going to be a problem, because some of the votes that Trzaskowski could get, they're going to go to someone else, presumably Szymon Hołownia. So it is going to be quite important for Tusk to win this presidential election. It will be the question of whether the opposition can keep the momentum. But then, as Anita said, that will not solve all of the problems.
Marcin, final point to you. Have you confidence in Donald Tusk heading into 2025?
I don't know. What I know is that this presidential elections will be crucial as far as the restoration of the rule of law is concerned. Tusk won a year ago because the Polish people realize how dangerous is this collapse, this crisis of the rule of law. And because of Duda, he was not able to restore the rule of law fully during the last year. With Trzaskowski in the presidential palace, I think he has a good chance for it. He could start this process with a new energy, because Trzaskowski will not veto the legislation that is to fix the Constitutional Tribunal and the Polish judiciary. Moreover, I believe that some of the criminal proceedings against the rule of law people are not started because Duda could pardon them. So again, with a new president, this threat will not longer be relevant. So I believe that with Trzaskowski in the presidential palace, this government can get a new energy, because this restoration of the rule of law was a great hope of all the people who voted for Tusk. So I think that May 2025 can change everything in this respect.
And Marcin, we will no doubt talk about Polish politics again plenty of times in 2025 to Aleks, Anna and Anita here with me in the studio. Dziękuję and thank you to you all. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.